what was it? In the intelligence area in Vietnam, and spent that over there. And when he came back to the States, he became. Am I in your way here? Okay. He came back and began working for the Principal Financial Group in Des Moines, Iowa. They were interested in developing a pension management program and investments in various areas of the world. And they took a bunch of young people that they called the young guns, and I wanted to educate them and send them out into these various areas to work on investments and working for part of their pension program in the United States. At that point, Russ joined an executive MBA program in Babson College in Wellsby, Massachusetts. And after finishing there, he came back to Iowa and was then told that he was going to be working in the Far East, in the Pacific area, and working and developing businesses and working with international development. But at the same time, Chanda had grown up in Hastings, Nebraska, and went to Hastings College, got a teaching certificate, and started doing some teaching, but she found she also enjoyed law. And so she went to South Dakota Law School and got a degree, her law degree. And after they got married, they went together much of the time over to Asia. And sometimes Chanda had to come back for some family matters and this sort of thing. But the two of them together spent quite a bit of time in Asia. They have lived on various occasions in Jakarta, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Pakistan, and Singapore. And because he was doing a lot of work in Beijing with the Chinese government, it was suggested that they moved to Beijing, and they lived in Beijing for a number of years together. And Chanda began teaching in the law school in Beijing, in the university, and taught contract law and also English as a second language. In the meantime, Russ was working with the Chinese government and with industry and individuals on trying to find programs and working with government relations, so that trying to figure out how the companies could work together, licensing agreements and partnerships and this sort of thing. So he was actively involved with the Chinese government and these different businesses, representing his financial group in the United States. This is where they got all of their fantastic experience on all the different countries in Asia, and they immersed themselves into the culture and with the people, and became very knowledgeable about the situations in which they were working. So when Russ and Chanda moved back to the United States in about 2002, he still was working as a international consultant for the Chinese government. And while he was in China, there was an interesting relationship because tried to be fair and equitable to all. So half of his salary came from the financial group in the United States and half from the Chinese government. So then once he got to the United States, he was still employed by the Chinese government for some matters that they needed consultation on. So it was with that history that we are introducing Russ and Chanda to us today, and they're going to give a little talk, and then they're going to open it up for questions.
Okay, I guess it's our turn, huh? So this is, I'm sorry.
Go.
Oh, okay.
Go.
That's where I get my orders from. So that's my personal attorney too. Yeah, Chanda and I are going to cover just a few points to bring up some interest in some different areas and maybe some questions that you might have. But we want it to be a real exchange rather than a lecture or a presentation type, because it's more fun to answer your questions and get into things that are new for us on that. I'm going to be speaking more from a business perspective, the culture of doing business and the culture of working with different peoples from that business standpoint. Chanda is going to be speaking more from a personal standpoint. The non-business relationships with people, building friends from that. But as you heard, she was in business herself, so she could probably do both sides of this very well. Going to kind of just like say shoot some points out, and then Chanda is going to do the same thing on that. We'll try not to take very much time here. You have to remember that in Asia, and in particular in China, because of its size, but this fits many other countries as well. There's not one culture. There's not one language. And so if you're going to do business within a country, you really have to do a lot more study and see what's going on. Most of the people that I met from the United States, now this has evolved over the years. I was over there 21 years, and so I had a chance to work with a variety of people. But they say, well, we're going to open up a business in Shanghai. We're going to open up a business in Beijing or Guangzhou. Okay? Well, those are three of the most advanced provinces or states in all of China, which means that the whole world gathers to those areas because it's easy to work with, and an American can pretty well get by with English on a non-business standpoint in those areas. But there's 300 dialects or languages spoken in China. Mandarin is not the only one. That's a language they officially came up with at one time to try to bring everybody together and mandated that everybody learn Mandarin Chinese. A couple of the differences between Southeast Asia and Greater China, but mainland China is where you're most interested in. How do they approach that initial relationship? Most of the Southeast Asians we've met, we just love the Southeast Asians. They are such nice people. But they have been invaded and controlled for so many hundreds of years. They're still developing their government. They're still developing their central languages, and some of these things are happening. Where China, you got a 5,000-year history in one place. So a whole different perspective that you're working with there. Relationships and trust kind of comes first on business in Southeast Asia. Where China, it's the opposite. It's money speaks first. So do you have the money? Do you have the access to the money? What can you do for us? What can you do for us now? Okay? So you have to balance those as you work for it. So in China, it's kind of what's in it for me. Okay? We don't really need you Americans or anybody else. So what are you going to do for us? We've been around 5,000 years. How long have you been around? Okay? So we've been through things different. Or who are the people that you need to take care of and how? And that's important, particularly in China. Okay? Who are the officials you need to work with? Who are the key people that you need to work with? As I tell people, who is the benefactor? We have to find out. That's the key. That's the trick. I said I don't work with people in Holland. We get away from it. But one night, Chanda and I were sitting there, and there's a knock on our door, and open the door, and there's old friend there, and he said, "I need your help." He said, the son of a friend, or maybe it was his, I remember now, but they have a meeting tomorrow. There's people flying in from China. They really don't speak or understand English. And my son's getting ready to take this position in this company in China that they're going to do a partnership with. And he was very nervous about it. Can you help me? Well, okay, you're kind of on a spot then. And so I said, I'll make some telephone calls. And I called a friend with a bank in Grand Rapids that was Chinese. And I said, can you come over here tomorrow? I need a translator I can trust. Yeah. So she dropped everything. She was a VP with a bank there and came over and acted as the translator. I made a couple calls to some of my contacts over on China and said, here's the company, what's the situation? Who's behind this? They came back and said, well, it's the sister-in-law of Wen Zhobel, who was the premier of China at that time. And they were so excited that they had this senior inside connection there. And I said, well, you know, Wen Zhobel is going to get a divorce as soon as he's out. Now, if you think he's going to let his wife's sister walk off of the business, you don't understand. And I would advise you not to go forward with that. And those are some of the things you have to look for. Who you are, what you have behind you, again, is everything in China and some so in Asia. And we've been very lucky on that. One of my strengths is developing relationships and knowing how to do that in various cultures. And I've been a member of Rotary for 43 years, and Lauren knows that. And we had several moves within the United States, and Rotary played a very important part of introducing us at each city we went to. And I thought, well, that should work overseas too, shouldn't it? So I contacted some ranking people with Rotary over there and let them know we were coming into Indonesia and had not been there before. And a gentleman met us when we got there, and that we'd made it to the airport without having to pay too much money under the table. And he met us the next day and said, my name is Hoyon Nimpuno, and I'm district governor for Rotary for this area, and I'm your sponsor for Rotary. So who do you need to see? What are you here for? What can I do to help you? And I told him I trusted him as a Rotarian. And he said, okay, I'll take care of that. I accomplished in 6 months what took most companies 3 years, simply because I had a good contact. Now, Hoyon Nimpuno happened to be a retired admiral in the Indonesian Navy. He was the general manager of the World Trade Center in Jakarta and on the board of directors of the World Trade Center in New York City. So he could get me where I needed to go. And I'll keep jumping forward from that. I won't give them all to you. That was just a good story I enjoyed. I had immediate attention in China because I represented a company with $800 billion of assets. And they're an investment management company, and they wanted some of that money. And to get it, they had to go through me to get it. So that gave me immediate level there. When I went into semi-retirement with Principal and started with a contract with the government of China, and I'd already been doing work that Principal was paying for with China, I ended up taking a position with a company called Festo Group, which stands for Foreign Enterprise Services Company. Now, I won't give you the whole background on it. You may have questions later, but it's the largest HR employee benefits company in all of China. 150,000 plus employees. And at that time, it was mandatory that all foreign companies coming in had to get their employees from this company. And that's an interesting dichotomy on there. It gave me immediate access to basically wherever I wanted in China. I was chief executive advisor to the chairman of the board. Now, he was a retired China Secret Service person, which is their version of the CIA. His brother was a senior vice minister for China Public Security, which is their version of the FBI. And quickly, and jump over it, and then I'm going to go to Chanda. When I went in for the interview with him, his English was better than everybody gave him credit for. Of course, his wife was a professor in the medical school at Harvard University, so he did a lot of coming back and forth himself over here, under a different name, by the way. And he sat down and said, well, I've read your portfolio. I know you were in Army intelligence. He says, I'm sure you know my background. I said, yes. He said, well, let's dispense with that because we're going to build a good company and not do it in that way. And so some things just fall into place. The thing I love most about it was that I got a government car for the next few years, and a government driver who was probably a spy on me too, what I did every day. But I loved that government license plate. I could park wherever I wanted to. I could cross lanes whenever I wanted to. I could go through lights. The only thing they wouldn't do is give me one of them horns. I wanted one of those little horns that government officials had. They wouldn't give me one of those. Chanda, tell us a little about what you have.
I think you should cover the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act
okay,
first, then I
okay.
will.
Now, I'll do that quick. Yeah, it's an important area. Everybody is aware of the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Probably not in depth of how it's used and how it's looked at by other countries. We are the only country in the world that attempts to impose their laws on other countries. That's what the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is. Now, it's actually a pretty good guide, and people do use it in other areas, but you have to understand it. And I learned the Foreign Corrupt Practices all inside out. And I talked to a lot of people that have been over there many years longer than I had at that time. And they came back and said, if you understand the Foreign Corrupt Practices law, it gives you a basis to move forward, to expedite what you're attempting to do much faster. Now, I'll give you just a couple of quick examples of it because I watched it very close, and I only had one time I had to turn it down in the time I was over there, back away from a project. Okay. Let's say that you have a shipload of motors from General Motors or whoever sitting off in the harbor, and you're having a dispute with the customs people. And that happens every day. And usually you have to pay a fee to the customs people. Okay. But the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act says, well, there's just so much money you can give for different things, except you can use value. Okay. So beside this ship of engines, you have a ship of bananas. Now, what's going to last longer? Those steel engines or those bananas? So I'm allowed to pay a higher percentage of the value of those bananas to expedite their release by customs because they're going to be rotten in a couple of weeks. Now, we're going to negotiate a long time on those engines if I don't want those brought in today because they can sit out there for years. They'll be out of date before they're destroyed. So it's understanding what you can do with the act on that basis. The one that I turned down, I was asked to be involved in an oil deal with a African country in China. And in the end, out of this whole thing, $9 million was to go to government officials that would be spread out and shared by many people. Okay. That was not illegal in that African country, and it was not illegal in China. So they could legally do that. I could not, according to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because I'm a U.S. citizen. That's deliberately paying government officials to do things that probably should not have been done or to take greater shares of theirs in Africa. So you have to know those things. Now, it was not held against me at all that I said, I cannot do this. I have to go over this one. And it was never held against me whatsoever. If anything, I had more respect that I stood by what I could do. Okay. The final little one, real quickly, one of the first jobs that I had with this FESCO group was to help them rearrange their group of companies, and there was 30, 40 companies within the group, as to which ones they would keep and which ones we would sell to raise capital in order to make this a private enterprise rather than a government enterprise. And I'm going through the list, and one of them just jumped out at me. I looked at that and I looked at Chairman Hahn and I said, "You have to be kidding me." He says, "I thought you would see that." They owned a factory in Texas that manufactured police helicopters for the United States. And these glass bubble type little helicopters that you see that they could use, that was a Chinese company manufacturing those for our police. And they thought it was hilarious that they had that all these years. And I had fun, but we did sell it to raise money. It wasn't one of the most profitable ones that we had. Chanda?
Selamat siang, Siona. Selamat siang saya. Terima kasih banyak untuk datang di sini hari ini. I have just greeted you in the national language of Indonesia, Bahasa, they call it. I said, good afternoon, everyone. My husband and I thank you very much for being here today. One of the things that the Principal Financial Group did very, very well for us when we moved to Jakarta was immediately arrange for high quality language training. We moved to the city of Bandung. We lived in our instructor's home for 8 weeks. And we studied language 7 or 8 hours a day, 6 days a week for those 8 weeks. And on the 7th day each week, she would take us out to see the area. So we learned about tea plantations. We learned about visiting volcanoes. We learned about how the communication system went. We got used to every child we met saying to us, "Hello, mister," because that's what they were taught in school. You were supposed to say to foreigners. So that part was incredibly helpful. I'm pretty good at language.
I'm not.
And language opens doors. It makes an enormous difference if you can speak to people in their own language. And it's a show of respect, but it's also levels things, if you will. It indicated to people that, yeah, they knew I was a foreigner. They might not know exactly where I was from, but if I was willing to speak to them in their own language, they knew I wasn't holding myself above them. And as Russ mentioned, the Indonesians are gentle, caring, delightful people who really welcomed us. And it was so much fun for me to be able to visit with taxi drivers, visit with my neighbors, visit with our landlord's wife. Our landlord and his wife lived next door to us. We chose to live in a local neighborhood. Most foreigners lived way across the city because that's where the international school was. And if we'd had children with us, but our son was already in college, so we didn't have to worry about that. So we picked out a local neighborhood, and we were the only ones in the area who were not Indonesian. That turned out to be a very, very good decision, not only because it was convenient for us to get to the office, saved him a lot of time, but also just because of the relationships we could develop. I was not accustomed to being the spouse, okay? I've always had my own career. And I had my all-time favorite job at the time we got moved to Indonesia. And it was tough for me to let that go. It took me 9 months to find a job. I never expected that. And I finally went to work for an NGO as their newcomers coordinator. And this was an international community center where I worked. So we had people literally from all over the world. Oil and gas is very, very big in Indonesia. So we had, investment companies from everywhere you can think of, big oil companies, all these major corporations flying in families. And a lot of the work I did was to help them figure out how to navigate what they needed to. One of the requirements of the Indonesian government was if you came into Indonesia, the number of people that came in your family, you had to employ that many Indonesians because you were taking jobs away from them. The way that was normally accomplished was, first of all, you had household help. Well, I'd had a cleaning lady. I thought, okay, no, this is household help that lives with you in your home 6.5 days a week, or 5.5 if you can get them to leave earlier. And this can be a source of friction because sometimes the household help didn't get along with each other, or sometimes they didn't like your rules. So I thought about this for a while and I finally decided, okay, I think the way to solve this is I'm going to try to hire a married couple. They obviously get along with each other. And I thought, you know, two of them, two of us, this should be okay. And they had their own area in the house. They had their own bathroom, their own bedrooms, their own little living room, their own kitchen. So I thought, you know, we can manage this just fine. And they were sterling. We loved them dearly. They kept the house spotless. They did most of the shopping for me because I very quickly determined that we really enjoyed a lot of the Asian or tropical, because this is a very tropical climate, very close to the equator. We liked their fruits and things, but I didn't know anything about them. I didn't know how to choose them. I didn't know what to do with them. So I would send Sumitro to the pasar, as they call it, bazaar, we would call it, and he would bring home all this wonderful stuff. And once in a while, when I went to a Japanese-owned grocery store where I bought our meat and things, I would attempt to buy something local and I'd bring it home. And as they were putting away the food, they would chuckle to each other and I'd say, okay, what did I do this time? And they'd say, well, those mangoes might be ripe enough to eat in maybe 2 weeks, madam. Oh, okay. So, you know, it was a high learning curve for us when we first got there. We also, Russ had to have a driver. The company required him to have a driver. Russ's driver's name was Dedi. Dedi was the largest Indonesian man we ever met. Is the Indonesians as a whole, I'm the same height at 5'2" as an average Indonesian adult male. This is a rice culture people. They are small. In China, you have rice culture people in the south, wheat culture people in the north who are bigger than Russ because of this, the difference in diet. So Dedi walks in the house. He's bigger than Russ. His father was career military. He has presence. He knew the city like the back of his hand. He was a superb driver. Now, bear in mind, folks, the biggest place I personally had ever lived was Grand Rapids. Jakarta, at the time we moved there, had roughly 11 million people. It is huge. Beijing's even bigger, but we'll get to that. Traffic is horrendous. A road that we would consider 4 lanes is at least 6, sometimes 7. You couldn't open your car door if your life depended on it because the next car is right there. So driving is a huge challenge. Distances and commuting require a lot of time. And naturally, this place I went to work was clear across the city. I didn't have my own driver at that time. I was taking taxis every morning. So I would call the taxi company, give them my address, tell them what time I wanted them there. And every morning they'd send me a different driver. Never failed. I have no idea how many hundred drivers they had. But one morning, I got quite a young man. And by the time we got to the first corner, he looked at me in the rearview mirror and he said, "Madam, may I practice my English with you?" In very good English. And I said, yes, if I may practice my Bahasa with you. And he looked kind of surprised. And of course, I said that to him in Bahasa. So all the way across the city, he spoke to me only in English and I spoke to him only in Bahasa. And we had a good time. It was fun for both of us. Eventually, I got a chance to get my certification to teach English as a second language through Cambridge University in the UK, which came to Jakarta and taught for some reason. I don't know why. But after that, I went to work for an international law firm. And it was quite a unique place in that the 4 people for whom the firm was named were all women. Kind of unusual in a Muslim country. They had several international lawyers. We had one from Canada. We had a couple of people from the United States. We had one from Ireland. And then they hired me. And my primary job was working with their brand new lawyers. If you keep in mind that in doing all this international contract work they did, writing contracts in English is complicated. When English is your 3rd or 4th language, it's more complicated. So I spent a lot of time with them making sure they didn't misplace commas or something that could sink the whole thing. And it was wonderful. I got to know these young people. They were caring, they were most considerate. And it was very, very enjoyable. But I had a really weird schedule there. So Russ decided to rent me a car. And I got my own driver, whose name was Muhyiddin. Muhyiddin spoke maybe 5 words of English on a good day. But he and I communicated wonderfully. We had no issues. He was a fine young man. And we both had exceptional experiences with our drivers. They were outstanding. Russ's driver actually had to rescue him one day when he was taking photos of something that certain members of the constabulary did not think was appropriate, and that he had to intercede and get ordered Russ back to the car, literally, and stood these guys up straight and said, he didn't do anything wrong and you're going to leave him alone. And they said, yes, sir, and went away. So that was nice.
That was when I discovered that my driver had also been in the Army, and I suspected he still had connections there. And I think his job was to watch me, both as an employee, but for the government.
I would be remiss if I did not speak a few words at least about living in a predominantly Muslim culture. Indonesia is very diverse. There's over 13,000 islands in the nation. And among them, every one of the world's major religions is represented, but it is over 90% Muslim. The largest Hindu temple in the world is in Indonesia. We have been there. Bali is all Hindu. And they're also Christians, more Catholics than Protestants, but there are both. Our landlords were Catholic, and people that lived across the street from us were Protestant Christians. And that was fun because she was the choir director for their church and they practiced at her home. She was the pianist. And often they would have rehearsal on Sunday before they went to the church, which was just a few blocks away. And one morning she absolutely brought me to tears because they were practicing the old rugged cross. I hadn't heard it in so long, and it really touched me. I got to know the neighbors, and this is something we enjoy sharing, but our landlord's wife, before I went to work, called me one morning and said, Chanda, the neighbors are all getting together for tea. Why don't you come with me? I said, well, I'd love to. So we walked down the street 3 or 4 houses and go in the home, and several of the ladies are already there, and we hit the door and the room went dead silent. And Annie stepped in front of me and she said, it's okay, Chanda speaks Bahasa. And they all went, oh, good. And then everything was fine. And we had a wonderful morning. And they all spoke a little English, But to think they were going to have to put up with somebody for a couple of hours, that they were going to have to try to speak English, was just not something that they were comfortable with. So that worked out, and again, very well. I also found it very helpful in shops. Talk with the employees at various places, at the salon, I could communicate well. Anywhere I went, I could communicate well. And that was really terrific. One of the things that nobody prepared us for, and indeed they could not have prepared us for, is the level of poverty that we witnessed. We did not grow up in affluent families at all. But I had never in my life thought it was possible to see people exist at the level that they did in Jakarta. It was heartrending. Waking every morning to the first call to prayer, being aware of when the prayer times were, so we allowed the people in the office or in our staff or around us, wherever they were, time to pray was very, very important in that culture. Once we moved to China, I immediately signed up for language classes. It was a disaster. I would go to class. The teacher would tell me I was doing a great job. I would go to the market. Nobody could understand a word I said. In Mandarin Chinese, there are 4 tones. There's ah, there's ah, there's ah, and ah. Okay, that means each word means 4 different things depending how you pronounce it. I was not good at getting those tones right. And I often wondered what I was actually saying to people because they'd turn their head and frown trying to figure out what I said. It was hard. And reading Chinese, forget it. She didn't even attempt to teach us the characters and so forth. But those tones, once you're on the top side of 50, get really, really tough to learn. And that's where we were. Beijing is a very controlled city as the nation's capital. It's probably the safest place we've ever lived, to be honest. There's a very high military presence. It's very controlled. We were given a list of places to choose from where we were allowed to live. We had no real choice in that way. There's a heightened sense of foreignness, if you will, because of that. When you can't read anything, when you can't really speak well with people. And one of the biggest adjustments for me with my many allergies was the level of pollution. And the air pollution has only gotten worse since we left. Many, many foreign families are no longer living in Beijing. It's simply not safe, particularly for children. The breathing is just not good. It's totally unhealthy. I did have the opportunity to teach for a California university in Beijing. And in addition to these were all master's level students that worked for international companies, and they needed to know about American law a little bit. So that was my assignment, was to teach them. And they had no knowledge about our Constitution or courts or any of that stuff, but they were fascinated by it. But the ESL, the English as a Second Language classes, I taught on Saturday afternoons. And it was a 3-hour class. That's a long haul. So I'd give them a break in the middle, 10 minutes or so, go for a walk, go to the restroom, whatever you want to do. I don't care. Very first day, young man walks up to me at the start of the break. He said, I would like to discuss with you the causes of the American Civil War. I said, all right, I would be happy to discuss that with you, but I said, we do not have time right now. So I said, if you would like to come back to me after class or we'll set a time, I will discuss that with you. He never did. I think he was laying down the gauntlet and I didn't take the bait. what I wanted to say to him was, I would like very much to discuss with you the causes of the Chinese Civil War when Chairman Mao became in power. I dared not say that. I had no idea who these young people were, who their connections were, what the ramifications could be if I said something wrong to one of them. The Chinese people know their own history, inside and out. They are proud of it. They can quote you precise information, far more than most any American I know. They know the details about their own country. And considering, as Russ said, you're looking at 5,000 years there, that's a lot to know, but they really know it. And I was always impressed with that. Russ's driver, Mr. Zhao, spoke quite good English. And he had learned English because he had originally studied to be a tour guide. So that's how he had to know it. He was a very good driver. He was a good man. Every 2 or 3 weeks, I would get to use the car for a half day or so to go to a couple of markets that were a little farther from the complex where we lived, where they had some more products that were more familiar to me, that I could actually read the labels. That was way welcome. I gave some of Russ's employees a nice amount of amusement sometime when I would come home from the grocery store with what I thought was a specific cleaning product that turned out to be something totally different because I'd misinterpreted the photo on the package. But anyway, Mr. Zhao and I came to appreciate the fact that we could speak openly with one another about many things. We were in Beijing at the time of the Columbine shootings in Colorado. And about a day or two after that was my time in the car with Mr. Zhao. And as we're pulling out of the parking lot, he wastes no time in saying to me, "Ms. Chanda, why do all these people have guns in the United States?" Not the way I'd planned to start the morning. We came back to that topic repeatedly. The Chinese are probably still today totally baffled by our gun culture in this country, and telling them that it's guaranteed in our Constitution blew their minds. They didn't see how that could possibly be true. It was a very difficult topic to deal with anytime it came up. And as I said, it did come up repeatedly. I really didn't make any Chinese friends. I made a lot of friends among the international community, but because my language was so poor, I didn't have the chance to make good friends in China like I had made in Indonesia. We stay in touch very frequently with a large number of the people that worked for Russ in Indonesia, the people that were friends in Indonesia, and both, because some of them became very good friends. And that is an enormous gift. It's something that we will challenge forever. We encourage you to travel internationally. It's wonderful. But living abroad is another thing altogether. It's a completely different level. You have the chance to really absorb the culture, to appreciate the culture. One of the best pieces of advice we were given before we moved was, you're going to encounter a lot of things, rules, government or policies, all this, that you've never heard of before. Think of it as this: it's not wrong, it's just different. That mindset was crucial to us. And I like to add to it, it's just different, and sometimes it's even better. There are places that can do some things just as well or a little better than we do in this country. But that being said, I have never appreciated this country more than I did living outside of it. There's a whole different viewpoint once you've had that experience. I still, at the playing of the national anthem, if it's done correctly, tear up. It means a lot. Having to come through passport control to get back into the country and having a passport agent say, "Welcome home." Great feeling. It's really a great feeling. Let's go to questions, please.
Okay, now we come to the fun part. I hope. Questions?
Yes, please.
Let me start with one.
All right.
If I'm an individual and I'm a business and I'm at a country level, what can we Americans, how can we better improve our relationship with China? What are the things that they dislike most about it?
Well, that's a loaded question. I think you first have to step back a little bit and first understand that the Chinese are not the government.
Yes.
Okay, they're people just like you and I. Okay, and the last time I checked, and it's been a while, they had 68 million members of the Communist Party out of 1.4 billion. And that was decreasing. So they then passed a law that, in effect, all students, all government personnel, police, whoever has any connection with the government must be members of the Communist Party. And that brought the number up to about 90 million, a little more acceptable. And what I'm saying is that what we see on TV and what we read in social media, you can't, folks, you just can't believe the majority of that. You really can't. It's written by people that have not, some of them haven't even been there. And it's careful. You have to be careful who you listen to. And so then you know the government. And you know what you're working with in the government. And you also have to be careful there of what you may believe. Okay. I developed a very good friend, still is to this day, who was in the Ministry of Trade for China. And he ended up being assigned to the consulate in Chicago as a senior commercial officer in Chicago. And I had no problem getting a visa. One of mine had to be renewed. I just called him up and said, "Let's have lunch." I would go in there, he'd take my visa from me and give it to his secretary. When we got back from lunch, I was all done and ready to go. Okay? So no lines, nothing like that. We had trust. We never were able to develop that really personal level relationship because, again, I didn't have the language. And even though he was pretty good in English, you know, there was still that understanding. Now, you would think because he was a fairly good level, lower government official as the head of the economic section for a consulate, you would think, well, he's a member of the party. Yes, he had to be. And you would think, well, he's an atheist. But let me give you the level of trust, because he calls me one day and I talked to him and he said, my daughter is going to go to Hope College. And would you and your wife be her personal and emergency contacts? And I said, well, Hope takes pretty good care of their people, but yes, we'd be honored to do that. Okay. Now, she didn't use the same name. Most of the Chinese that are in the United States go into universities and college and so forth. That's a different name they're using. That's not necessarily their same need. And that's primarily those that have money, the military, the government officials, and so forth that change on that. I had another really good friend, another government official. We were unpacking on 9/11. Moving into our condo that we had bought here. We didn't have a TV, didn't have a radio, didn't have anything on at that time. We didn't know Bill and Joy yet at that time, so we couldn't run over there and knock on their door. Our daughter-in-law called and said, "Do you have a TV on?" Well, no. Well, she says, "Unpack it." You know, there's planes just flew into the World Trade Tower, and we did. The next day, I received my first call, and it was in the daytime, so that person 12 hours difference had to be calling at night. It was another government Chinese official clear out in Western China in the middle of nowhere, calling to say, "Mr. Miller, are you and your family okay?" So you can develop friendships in there with what you're doing. So you need to go in, Lauren, with that mindset. But at the same time, you have to be aware that they work for the government. And they have rules to follow, and you need to know what those rules are and how they're worked. So back to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and again, you need to know that if you're going overseas. I can't pay you money to break either the US or the Chinese laws to accomplish what I want. That's against the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But I can pay you a fee to expedite the service if I have the relationships. I can pay you to take my request off the bottom and put it on the top. And that's okay. So you have to have the positioning, you have to have the relationships to work within that fabric that's there. And you have to be extremely careful of who the people are you hire. And I cannot tell you how many senior executives I met, in particular from the United States, that would go in and the translator is vital to you. And you need to know the family background, and you need to know a lot about that person. Just because they graduated from Hope College or Michigan State University or Michigan University doesn't mean they're a good translator. That's a whole different field that you're playing in there with that. And remember, up until 2006, all employees of foreign companies and foreign governments had to come from FESCO Group. And there were two branches, one for commercial, one for government. And I guarantee you, every one of those employees that came out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the government were reporting back to somebody as to what you were doing. And probably so with a lot of the people on the commercial side, because they were the sons and daughters of government officials, military officials, and so forth, or they wouldn't have got the prestigious jobs to work for the international company. And furthermore, they wouldn't have had the chance to come over here to Hope College or wherever it is and study and get a degree. And people would run out to Hope College or wherever it is and say, "Do you have anybody here that's from China?" "Yeah, okay, I want to meet them." "You're hired. You're going back with us." And they love that, because then they're on an expat package, make a lot more money, and reporting every move that you make. So I don't know if that answers totally your question, Lorraine, but it's a difficult one. Yes. For us, as foreigners, the healthcare was pretty good. You had to know where to go, and because of the traffic, you had to have it planned out. You know, if there was a local place you were going, if you needed somebody quickly. But we had emergency kits and all kinds of stuff in the cars all the time, because if you have a car accident, you'll be lucky if an ambulance got there within 2 hours. And you'd probably be dead by the time they arrived. And so we put all of the people in the companies that I had through emergency training, through CPR training, taught them how to handle, if there's a broken bone, what do you do with it until we can get you someplace? And normally, unless your car was damaged, the thing you do is just load them in your car and take them. You don't wait for the ambulance, because it may not get there. In every capital city in the world, there is an international hospital for the presidents of visiting countries to go to. So if Bill Clinton or Obama or whoever it was in Beijing or in Jakarta, there was a hospital set up for that level of care. And that's where we were allowed to go as foreigners. And some of the local medical clinics and so forth weren't too bad. And there were a number of international ones in there. France had one, you know, we had a separate one that you could go to in there. So for us, pretty good. For the locals, horrible. I won't even get into the tales I could tell you about how the locals are treated when they go into a hospital. I mean, you get a bed, that's it. Once in a while, a doctor may come by, depending upon how much money you're willing to pay the doctor to come to you rather than that bed over there. But the family has to be there. The family does all of what nurses do here. You know, you have to bathe, you have to feed, you have to bring the food with you to feed them. If you're locals, it's a tough life medically.
When we went to live in China, I was under the impression that they had national medical care. I thought that was one of their government benefits. Totally untrue. Absolutely, completely, totally false. And that came as a big surprise to me. Another one of the misconceptions.
Yeah.
You mentioned Indonesia and found poverty. Okay. And you discussed how you can move up with poverty. You know, as a tourist, it's always been very upsetting, but I don't know what to do. What did you do?
Well, it depended on the situation because you don't want to shame people. But if there were things that we could do, one thing we learned very quickly was even very, very low amounts of money were very, very significant to these people. And some of the examples that we saw was there was a family that worked our neighborhood whose job was to go through everybody's garbage to collect the recyclables. They could then sell the recyclables, and that was what they lived on. Well, when I first saw people rooting through our garbage, I was very alarmed. I didn't know what was going on. And our household staff explained this to me. This is what they do. They had an actual word for that profession, if you will. And it was a husband and wife, and they had young children. But a lot of times when you buy things from local people, they expect you to barter with them on pricing. They'll give you a price. They expect you to come back with a lower price. This can go on for a long time. We learned rather quickly that we didn't bargain too hard. We gave them the satisfaction of bartering a little bit, so we didn't seem condescending. But on the other hand, that extra dollar wasn't going to make a lot of difference to us, but it could make the difference between whether they ate that day. So there were things like that we could do as well. And we looked for opportunities to assist in various ways that we could. One of the hard things in Indonesia was children had to wear school uniforms. And if a family couldn't afford the uniform, the children couldn't go to school. And that was always deeply, deeply disturbing to me. When we were living with our language teacher, when we were first there, Russ would go out sometimes with his camera and walk and take pictures of especially children after asking permission. He would then get access, because that was old style cameras, you know, not just on your phone and there it is forever. He would go and have those developed, and he'd get extra copies made, and he'd take the copies back and give them to the parents. And there was a woman that lived almost next door to the home of our teacher, who had a daughter who was about 9 months old. And when Russ gave her the pictures, she burst into tears. She'd never had a picture of her child before. And it was such a simple thing to do. So you look for opportunities to do what you can do.
Yes.
You mentioned being reported, that people were taking information, reporting. What kind of information are they reporting or looking for?
Just about everything you would say. And then the people they would report to would determine whether or not it's useful or not. Again, like I say, I met with a lot of senior officials from different countries and again, back to the United States again. I'd like to take something like this and just back you on the head and say, listen, really listen to what we're saying before you get into trouble. Okay? Because they would sit in the car talking to each other. Let's say they're getting ready to go into a meeting with a government or local partner possibility, and they're just talking back and forth, and there's all kinds of facts they're discovering, not realizing the driver speaks perfect English. But you didn't know it because the driver never used it. They didn't want you to know it. And so that's money to the driver. Right? So if the driver says, aha, we know how much money they're willing to spend, they're going to get that information to somebody because they're going to get money for it. And they got you before you even start. Just all kinds of little things like that is there. I knew my phone was tapped, probably in Indonesia as well, but I knew my cell phone was tapped. I knew my
Our
phone
our landline in the apartment was both, when the phone would ring in the apartment, you could pick it up, there'd be like a 3-second lag, a large hum, and then the person, it like, yeah, okay, I'm ready, turn it on,
But see, I expected that because I had a contract with the government. And I came back every other month. I was back here when I was living in China for the last few years when China was back here. I reported to one of our government entities every time I came back. I loved them because they met me at the door of the plane and we went around security. I didn't have to stop any place. We'd go to the United Business Lounge. My luggage would be there, everything ready to go. And I was working with them on industrial espionage. And what could we do there? Of course, the biggest problem, as we now beginning to realize, is a lot of these students that came over here to the universities, and the universities are saying, give me more money, I like that. And they're just hauling everything from the university back.
And in the time you've been home, what's changed in the way of these traditions and rules and that kind of thing? You've been home for a decade now, haven't you?
Well, since 2015.
15, okay. What has changed that you know of? Not so much in the Communist Party, but just in some of these traditions and rules and that kind of thing.
A difficult question. I still do a lot of reading every day on what's happening in Pakistan, in the Philippines, Malaysia, China, Indonesia, any place I did business or lived or worked, and it's just an interest that I have. But I read people, unless you know who they are, you can get them on LinkedIn and they'll publish some stuff on there. But one of the people I follow, a good friend of mine, he is the head of the European Chamber of Commerce,
in Beijing.
fellow Rotarian in Beijing, and he writes from the European view. And he's obviously pro-European. He's also German, and so a little more towards the German view. I follow another guy who retired as chairman of the board of ABCO Worldwide, which is one of the world's largest consulting companies. He's an American. He writes from his view. Another friend who is from Hong Kong, and he retired as a senior VP for Shell Oil Company. He writes from an Asian view, and different ones I read. And then what I do is I take all of that, put it together, and somewhere in the middle is the truth. You have to learn to read between the lines, especially with the Chinese. That's where the truth is at on there. The biggest change I've seen since 2015 is not in the rules or the laws. Very few of those have changed. The people who interpret those rules and laws have changed. So President Lee looks at it a lot different than President Zhang did. Same rules, same laws, but how the Central Committee, the powers of nine and those choose to do that. Now, courts in China are primarily military people appointed to judges and courtships. Now, I was doing a lecture at John Marshall Law School in Chicago a few years ago. And it was a long lecture, and we were talking about, again, the law, the rules, so forth in there. And I walked in and I'm standing at the podium and I'm looking at this line of Chinese people lined up along the back wall. And I called the dean of the school over and said, Dean Baker, those are Chinese government officials back there, aren't they? He smiled and said, yeah. And I said, why are they here? He says, they're here to begin to learn how the US looks at technical issues, you know, websites, all this technical side, because that was new to them. And they really didn't know how to do it. And John Marshall Law School has a tremendous relationship with the government of China. And so they were teaching that. So I gave my same lecture, but I could tell, you know, who really spoke English well, because they sit back here and grin and smile. So we had a little fun with them. So hopefully that helps.
15 years ago, the company that I worked for was involved in China. I was indirectly involved with some of it. We always had to have a Chinese partner, and it always seemed like there was a connection from that Chinese partner to the Chinese government.
Yep.
Is that pretty much the same? Has it gotten better or worse or anything?
It got a lot better up until the current president came in. And now it's gotten much worse. I mean, you're not even going to get a Chinese partner today. They don't even want you there. You know, give them your company and get out of here. They've got all the technical knowledge and everything they need out of it. That doesn't mean there's not good partners there, because there are, but you really have to do a deep dive to find out. In Asia, and particularly in China, before I would take on a contract to do a joint venture, I had a requirement, and if you wouldn't meet it, I didn't want anything to do with you. I didn't need you. I didn't need your money that bad. Here are my requirements. So you say, okay, this is who you're going to do business with. You want to do a partnership with that. And I said, all right, the first thing you're going to agree to is we're going to pick 3 to 6 people out of the Chinese company that will be the people that make the factory work, or whatever it is. And they're going to the US factory, and they're going to be there anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. Okay. And they're going to look at it from the standpoint, well, if you bring this over, can I make it work in China? Okay. The US company has to do the same thing in reverse. I don't want any attorneys involved. I don't want your financial officer involved. I don't want anybody involved. I just want the factory level workers. Okay. Now they can come back, and we already know whether they've made enough friends they can get along. Okay. And if we found out they can get along, that's a big check. Okay. And they come back and they say, well, it's difficult, but if we do this or do this, we can make it work. See, the problem is we bought these machines from Germany, these machines from Japan, these machines from the United States. We don't know how to make them work together. So it's going to cost us more than we thought, because we're going to have to get rid of a lot of stuff if we use strictly what the US brings into it. Okay. After that's over, if things look good, now we bring the attorney. And I tell the attorneys, look, don't tell me you can't do this. figure it out. Now, we can't maybe do it exactly the way we wanted to, but what's the best way? Bring the financial officer in. What's it gonna cost? It's gonna cost you more now than it was the day before because you just found out you gotta help them replace the machines. Okay, now, maybe you can't pay it all now. But what do we need to do in 3 years, 5 years, and 10 years to make it pay off, to make it work? Okay, now we get to the MOUs and we get to making it work, but we have a pretty good idea it will work. Most American companies used to, and they're getting better, but they used to came in, the first thing they did was sign an MOU. And that tied their hands behind the back before they even got started. They don't know if they like each other yet, and they've already signed a legal document. And to the Chinese, that was absolutely amazing. Why would you do that? But fine, if you want to do that, that's to our advantage. Sign that thing, start giving us money. Works both ways. Yes.
What's the business day look like in Jakarta or Indonesia or in China? Does it start at a certain time? Does it end at a certain time? Do they work into the night? Are there 4-day weeks? What's it look like? Do they have naps in the afternoon?
I'm gonna let Chanda answer that. But you also need to throw in an earthquake or two.
Yeah. The places I'll start with Indonesia. They have definite start times and they will have certain employees that are there at that time every day. What I very quickly learned in the law firm was there was no stop time. And that's typical of law offices everywhere in the world. You work till that day's work was done. There were many days I did not leave the office until 7:30 in the evening. And I was very secondary to the key work that was being accomplished there. They take a lunch break at the NGO where I worked first. We started at 7:30 in the morning, but we tried to be done by 4. And one of the reasons for that was with a little luck, you might get home before the worst of the traffic. And a lot of times that was about when the children got home from school, and a lot of these women needed to be home. You know, their children were still adjusting, and they didn't want to go home to just the household staff. They wanted mom there. So that was a part of it. The Chinese are very regulated in their society. They're very precise. They're very exact in what they do. And I think there it was much more structured even than it was in Indonesia in terms of that side of it. The Chinese are very self-centered, for lack of a better word. As Russ mentioned, they don't need us for anything. You know, in Jakarta, the Indonesians welcomed us with open arms. They needed what we were bringing. The Chinese really don't need anybody, and they'll be very blunt in telling you so. So they didn't care if we were there or not, you know, basically stay out of the way. But the people that worked for us were very caring. They were very, very, did everything they could to make it easier for us at every level. And one thing I was going to share with you too, because I found this so remarkable, was one of the young women that went to work for us was from Inner Mongolia. She was a 3rd generation Christian. I never had the opportunity to sit down with her and say, where did those missionaries come from? How did missionaries end up that many years ago in Inner Mongolia? I don't know the answer. But her family was very, very strongly Christian. And her younger brother was a gifted musician, and he'd gotten arrangements made to go to school in Florida. And she was very concerned because she didn't think his English was good enough. So when he's getting ready to come over here to go to school, she says to Russ, can you and Chanda sit down with my brother and interview him? Because I want to see how he does. And she was right. His English really wasn't very good. But he explained to us that the university recognized that and already had him signed up for their intensive program, you know, to bring him up to speed. And since he was going to be majoring in music, music is a pretty universal language. So in some ways, he was going to be better off than he might have been otherwise. But one of the questions he asked us in the interview was, if I meet young women there, can I assume that they'll be good Christians? And how does one safely answer that? I think we kind of hedged and said something to the effect of, not necessarily. That's going to have to be something that you figure out. And of course, his sister is quite concerned that he's going to take root over here and she'll never see him again. And whether that happened or not, I honestly don't recall right now.
Keep up. Other questions?
Yes.
And listening to the news, I can get rather discouraged about how we do things in the United States.
Mm.
Can you name a couple of things you said you appreciate about United States, things that bring a tear to your eye?
Well, I think, Indonesia is a very young country. They did not actually become an independent nation until the end of World War II. They had been a Dutch colony for hundreds of years. Don't get me started on that issue. I know you with Dutch origins have problems with that one, and I have problems with it too, but from the other side. Then, just when they thought it couldn't get worse, the Japanese took over. They were completely occupied during the war. It was hell. When they declared their independence after the war, Sukarno was the man who pulled that off. Their constitution, or their I guess we would call it a Declaration of Independence, consists of a single sentence. I've actually seen the document. It says, "We are independent as of August 17, 1948. All details to be settled later." That's a little different than the structure that we have in this country, that the protected rights that we have, our abilities to be independent and make decisions about where we live, what we do for a living, how we choose to live, what we want our own faith to be, all those kinds of issues that other people may not have at all. It was while we were living in China that for the very first time, Chinese citizens were allowed to choose where they lived. Prior to that, they were told, you will remain in this community. When you got ready to go to college, you were told what you would major in. They had no choice whatsoever. And all of a sudden, they found themselves with millions of engineers that they didn't have enough work for because they'd made too many kids engineers. They had many, many, many people who spoke Russian because for a time that was very important. It wasn't so much anymore, but that's what they made them study. So, it's things that we are so accustomed to that seem so simple and straightforward to us that just aren't in other places.
Yes.
When you were there and with people, did you get any sort of interest in their coming to the United States? Any of the people such as
Oh, all
sure.
of them.
Sure, absolutely,
Uh,
absolutely.
regardless of what you read or what the world says, about the United States, and we have problems right now. We have some big, big problems that we need to take care of, and I have faith that will be done. And part of my faith is based on immigrants. And it's immigrants that built this country, and it's immigrants, in my opinion, that will save this country. Because they will take the jobs, they will do the things that the rest of us don't want to do. Okay, and that's part of society as it moves up. It's just there. Don't underestimate the education and the background of many of these immigrants just because they can't communicate with you in English. Okay, and don't just blanket cover a country. Somebody mentioned Pakistan over here, and I had an assignment with the Pakistani government for 3 years that I went over there. Where's my train of thought go? Oh, yeah, here we are. Chanda and I met a young lady when she was a student at Western Academy here,
Western Seminary, yeah.
Western Seminary. She is now the first and maybe still the only
Yeah,
senior professor in Pakistan that is a Christian. And her brother, used to be her father, is now the head of all Christian churches in the country of Pakistan. And she was right here. And it came up at a Rotary meeting, or there you are over there. And somebody mentioned something about having dinner with some of our foreign exchange students. And I asked the question, do you ever take time to take some students out from Hope College or Western Seminary and talk to them? I mean, if you want to learn about living in another country, just invite a student to your home. Don't take them to a restaurant. Invite them to your home for lunch or dinner.
it's the ultimate honor in their mind.
And ask them, please tell me about your
home.
country, your home. And then just sit back and shut up, because they will talk and talk and talk, and they will give you more information. Now, I did that for another company here in Holland that I agreed to help out, and they were going to do a joint venture with somebody from another country. It'll remain unnamed now. And I said, well, get out to Hope College. I happen to know that there's some students out there from this country, and visit with them. And they found a student they were very impressed with out there, and they talked to me about it. And I talked to some other people and said, it'll work. She was a junior at that time. So she took a year off, very well paid, by the way, to work for this company to help them put together their package with a South Korean company. Then she went back and finished her degree. Okay. What a valuable asset you have. And the other is the US embassies, the State Department, the consulates. Those people are there to help you. Now, the problem is, the last time I talked to them about something in China, they spent 80% of their time getting Americans out of trouble, which allows only 20% of their time to help you and do what their job is supposed to do. And if they would have bothered to visit, to register with the consulate, visit with the people, I mean, they're there for you, your tax dollars. They can do tremendous help for you. But talk to them before you get in trouble, not after you get in trouble. It's a lot easier. Yes.
Anyone else?
I've had the pleasure of living beside these folks when they came back to the US. And many of these stories today, I just shut up and listen again. I've heard many of them before, and it's very fascinating.
Anyone else? Well, Russ and Chanda, we appreciate your coming today and telling us about your experiences in Asia and in China, and some of the things that we can look out for. And if we are lucky enough to be able to go over there someday, maybe at least get in touch with the consulates and so before we
Yes.
go. So,
Please.
but thank you so much for your willingness to come and share your
Thank you.
experiences.
Now, one other thing, Lauren, that Bill knows is if you're ever out by the big bay condos and the flag is on the back of my boat, that means that the refreshments are open.
Our son actually is an entrepreneur, and he's established his own international company. And he deals in very high-end spirits. Works predominantly with the agave industry in Mexico. So Yeah, interesting.
And he is completely fluent
In
in
Spanish.
Spanish, and that's why he can do this.
Yeah.